Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining Arbitrum's Open House. Today, we will be covering the high-level principles and best practices for token design. So, at a high level, we'll look at token design, token supply, demand, incentives, and best practices. But token design is still a relatively new discipline. It's just as young as the industry that it takes part in is, and so it's still very experimental. We have more and more use cases as more projects come out with innovative designs, and we have lots of fundamental use cases that have stood the test of time so far, but it is still very much evolving. So I think tokenomics can be considered as the intersection of economics, incentive design, so psychology, user behavior, and like traditional finance, but all of them together in a very unique setting. And so I think some of the key considerations and steps to go through when we consider our tokenomics is from a supply perspective. So that's things like our token vesting, our token emissions, which are also underpinned by how we sell our token, both privately and publicly, to VCs, investors, and to retail participants or otherwise in different sale formats. So we want to look for sustainable unlocks, and we want to align incentives and avoid supply shocks. Then, just like with any price equation, supply and demand, we want to look at the demand side of the equation. So demand and utility, where fundamentally the demand for our token will come from the utility that it offers, which is a function of the utility that our product itself offers, our protocol, our DApp, whatever it may be. And so we want strong token utility and mechanisms that drive long-term value and retention. So having done these first two somewhat qualitative and somewhat quantitative steps, ideally we would then step into a more quantitative token modeling scenario where we run simulations for different variables and really go into the detail of scenario planning, testing, and analysis to understand what the key levers are that influence here. And this can be as simple as a basic Excel where we consider um, what the monthly sell pressure of our token could be, or the monthly staking yield, all the way down to a digital twin programmed in programming language of your choice to really try to simulate as much as possible our token economy. And then as we've iterated through understanding our product growth, our product iterations, and our tokens integration into that, it eventually becomes time to launch that token to the market publicly. And so having a liquidity strategy that is both working with market makers, understanding the launch venues of centralized exchanges, decentralized exchanges, and ensuring that the conditions are such that the token can have a successful launch with hopefully somewhat reduced volatility, and then continuing to have best practice tokenomics is what's going to lead to the biggest probability of a sustainable price and good price action in the future post the token generation event and launch. And so what are some of the values of a token? Just at a high level, it allows us to incentivize in ways that aren't necessarily possible in traditional business. So it can align user behavior with our network's goals through incentivization. So we can incentivize positive or disincentivize negative actions that either benefit or take from our protocol, overall improving the quality of our product. It can help to overcome the cold start problem and bootstrap network effects, which are absolutely key to reaching kind of escape velocity with our growth and success. Whereas historically, traditionally, you may raise lots of funds from a VC and then use those funds on expensive user acquisition campaigns. A token can be a substitute for that, and if used correctly, can help to incentivize early adoption and support from a community. And then part of that is the ownership that is enabled by distributing ownership, and is what really enables aligned incentives. But certainly don't underestimate the impact of a token. It really is a serious undertaking that requires significant management. It can not really make a bad product good, but it can certainly make a great product bad if it's not managed correctly. So a token is naturally going to influence adoption, retention, and the behavior of your user base, particularly depending on how you structure your incentives using it. It's going to really impact your financials, whether that's your project valuation, token valuation, and the revenues and rewards that go to the product and to the holders, depending on how that's structured. Now, these are certainly benefits, but depending, and we'll look at this later, on how easily you can integrate it with your product, really depends on how much value there is that could potentially be accrued to the token. And we can't avoid the fact that having a token introduces significantly more management, both financial, economic, and technical for the implementation. And with that comes exploit and attack vectors, significant potentially legal and regulatory considerations, and volatility that you have to manage the expectations of the community, the sentiment of the token and the project. It is a significant undertaking that shouldn't be um, that shouldn't be um, really misunderstood. And so looking at token supply is fairly well understood in the sense that we see every year new projects launching and every year certain trends changing. So historically, looking back to 2017, 2018, and prior, all the way back to the Ethereum public sale, for instance, the amount of tokens that were going to the public in ICOs was really large. So 2017, we're looking at 55%. But we see that trend change over time as public sale amounts reduce and the majority of the token is captured through either we see from 17 to 18 an increase from 2 to 13% in private investors, and that stayed fairly consistent. Likewise, has the core team allocations, but I think the biggest shift that we see is the rapid increase in the amount that is um, that it goes to community incentives and distribution. So I think that this can be a signal of just how powerful appropriate incentivization and distribution to community members and early participants can be when done correctly. And looking at token supply, supply is just one side of the equation. We want to really set ourselves up for success in this domain by ensuring that we really stick to best practices that are understood and not to stray necessarily too far from best practices, because supply can be won't necessarily ensure success. I would say that that comes certainly from the demand side of the equation, but it can lead to your downfall if not managed correctly by either having too aggressive of a release schedule or uneven or unfair distributions of allocations to insiders, for instance. And so understanding and looking at what is widely shared as best practice and looking at comparable success stories can be a good way to ensure that you're following best practices from a supply perspective. So just taking Aave's token distribution schedule, for instance, we have um, we have a variety of allocations and percentages, and ensuring that you're thinking about this early on as you're designing your token and understanding from a fundraising perspective, how much of my token at what valuation, potentially in addition to equity, do I need to sell in order to give myself sufficient runway to build my product, whilst not selling so much that I have an unsustainable amount of the token in the hands of investors, as opposed to having the ability to use it for rewards or to give to core contributors or to incentivize users. And so I think the biggest one to avoid is unsustainably fast unlocks. We see all the time projects that have either no unlocks or very, very quick unlocks where the token is being vested to either um, often insiders and investors, and the sell pressure is just not manageable in the early days. And and we'll look at this in a upcoming slide, whilst the technology is absolutely crucial, sentiment is very important in momentum and community building. And so having a successful early Price action is really key to continued success, I would say. Not that it can't be overcome. However, you want to set yourself up for success. And when you do set up your supply dynamics such that there is a possibility for very heavy sell pressure, then the amount of demand that you have to stimulate to counteract that can sometimes just be unachievable. And so you want to give yourself the best possibility of success. Some examples of what could lead to unsustainably high sell pressure is too large an unlock at TGE for private investors or for advisors and then insiders. If 30% of your um, total allocation is going to private investors and insiders, and 10% of that, or more even in some instances, is being unlocked at TGE, yet only 0.5% or 1% of your token supply is there in liquidity. You can see how that can potentially become a challenge. But certainly the more interesting and I would argue important aspect is from the perspective of token demand. And I think that this is a great representation and understanding of what fundamentally produces the token price, or how is the token price calculated by the market. And there are two components, the speculative component and the fundamental component. So I would always suggest that we focus on the fundamental component, which is derived from both the underlying product and the token utility. So fundamentally, the value that your product is creating for the ecosystem is also influences the potential value and utility of the token that is integrated with it. So always aiming to make the token improve token utility and integration with the product, but just like in any other endeavor, to focus on the product and the product market fit and the value that you're creating through that as the number one priority. However, you can't deny that there is a large speculative component when it comes to token launches and the long-term success of tokens. And part of this, I think, is by having a clear vision, communication, and community, which all takes effort and serious commitment to build, cultivate, and continue to engage, so that you have, just like we mentioned with the incentivization and rewarding of early participants, you have early and loyal users of your product who want to support your product journey and evangelize your product for yourself. I think that building a community that can help to really encourage participation is the healthiest and most sustainable way, but that community is also interlinked with the tokenomics through their rewards and incentives. And just looking at this from another perspective in terms of the product, but product lifestyle with a focus on tokenomics, fundamentally, as with any business, we need to identify the problem, and the size of that problem, I would say, determines the potential value creation. And so creating a product to resolve that problem is just, I suppose, business 101. But in this instance, we have to really understand how a token can integrate here. And so these are all iterative stages, I would say. No one identifies the perfect problem and builds the perfect product straight away. Neither would you have a perfect token integration right away. And so as you iterate on your product, as you understand your problem better, understand how can the token be integrated to improve the product, to improve the user experience, and to bootstrap users. Then just as the problem is the limit for the value of the problem is the limit for the value of the product, the amount of value created in that product is, at a fundamental level, the limit for the value that can be captured by the token. And this slide, I think, just highlights that one more time. The value creation, the size of the product itself, the capture, which can be through various mechanisms, would be that fees or otherwise. Fundamentally, these three stages determine the amount of the value that can be accrued to the token. And that could be through its utility, buybacks, discounts, revenue share, and governance is always an aspect, but I wouldn't say utility just by itself. Um, and so when we're looking at value accrual, utility, and economic security, I would say, as we often find ourselves in a trilemma, there's a trilemma between economic security, utility, and value accrual. Because the economic security, for instance, of Terra Luna, as we all know from the crash, you would say is very, very low and problematic. And it's because of this lack of economic security that it was at the other end of the spectrum in terms of short-term value accrual and supposed utility. But as as is often the case, if you push something to the limit in one direction, it can be catastrophic in another. However, looking at another edge of this triangle, Uniswap, for instance, that has um, very good economic security, is a very well established token and protocol, but you could argue that it doesn't maximize as much as it could on value accrual due to the lack of fee switch or revenue distribution value accrual to token holders. However, the utility of the product, the perhaps speculative component, and the economic security are all considerations that mean that the value is still accrued. And so understanding where you are or where you can place your token on this triangle whilst being sustainable is a key decision. Um, okay. And so when it comes to designing your tokenomics, which will be different for every use case, whether it's a DEX, a launchpad, a game, you name it, they will all be slightly different. However, there will be instances of either competitors or prior success or failure stories that you can learn from. So understand what other products in your verticals are doing. What do they do well and what do they do badly? There's now been significant experimentation in incentives, mechanism designs, airdrop structuring, whether that is retroactive or it's an airdrop with an option token so that users have to actually execute an option to receive their airdrop. Different governance mechanisms all have been tested fairly rigorously now, and understanding what might be best for your project based on historical examples and future innovation, and then innovating appropriately. Where should we innovate and where shouldn't we? Use cases and utility. Your product itself, absolutely, is where we should be innovating and um, trying to compete and bring more value. Incentives, how do we integrate it with the product? How do we do it in novel ways that are still sustainable? And then, of course, on the technical aspects and value creation. But where we probably want to emulate best practices are certainly with legal structurings and setups, with regulatory compliance, and when it comes to things like token allocations, token vesting, and making sure we're following best practices there. So understand your vertical. There's some great resources out there, some of which I'll share at the end, which can really help you to turbocharge your understanding of each vertical and the best practices. And over the long term, we want to reduce volatility. We want to optimize for sustainable growth and price appreciation for the long-term success of our project. Because I think designing tokenomics that focus on long-term sustainability over short-term price increases allows for the product to continue building and focusing on that iteration. Any unsustainable short-term price movements can be a huge distraction and challenge. Want to implement robust mechanisms which ensure the protocol can handle adverse conditions without collapsing. Edge cases are always key. Like we can never assume that we'll be operating in under perfect conditions, and so this is where in the first slide we mentioned uh, qualitative iteration, but then eventually quantitative testing, scenario testing, and always considering the worst case scenario, particularly when it comes to like economic actors and participants who may not always be rational, but trying to align them as much as possible with our incentives. And that's why we want to avoid unsustainable incentives, whether that's high yield without any foundation, for instance, lazy staking, or just providing a fixed APY to people staking or using our protocol without that just coming from token emissions is fundamentally unsustainable, and those users won't be sticky or stay around. They'll simply leave when those incentives leave. Speaking of incentives, one of the most powerful aspects of tokenomics, we want to design them with our product in mind, to really accelerate the adoption and improve the value of our product. And so we want them to accelerate us towards critical mass. So in network effects, the value of the network kind of hockey sticks once it reaches a critical mass. For a social media application that can be millions and millions of people. For Uber, it's when we can match sufficient numbers of drivers and riders in a location so that it makes sense. And that's why initially lots of applications or products going into new regions or markets will start with incentives, because we need to hit that critical mass as quickly as possible. And so we want to do the same with our incentives. And I think the best way we can do that is by ensuring that we incentivize actions that are actually beneficial to the project itself. So if I am a decentralized exchange, I want to incentivize liquidity provisioning so that the traders can trade with lower slippage. So if traders trade with lower slippage, then you anticipate volumes will increase at that venue because it's more competitive. With volumes increasing, fees increase, and therefore there are more fees that go back to my liquidity providers and token holders. And so really we want to create this flywheel effect of improving product value and user experience through incentivizing the correct actions. And so by using this opportunity to directly enhance product quality, features, and utility, and increasing user satisfaction and retention, ultimately leading to user growth. And so we might be motivated to over-incentivize or under-incentivize. And this is where, as with everything, iteration and testing, and I think that where certain points programs or airdrop strategies can be beneficial to iterate and test and understand what is our sweet spot for incentivization. Under incentivize, and people will use either a competitor or another solution. Over incentivize, and you're having diminishing returns on your investment. Even though treasury tokens have a very low, if not zero, cost basis for a project, I would say that we want to consider those as real dollar value that we are investing for an ROI when it comes to incentives. And so incentivizing the highest ROI actions within our product, if we take the DEX again, is that liquidity provisioning, is that reducing fees, etc. Testing and understanding those, and using our incentives and our tokens like a budget where we want the highest ROI. Okay, so I think just to pause here, tokenomics is huge in its breadth and depth, because there are so many considerations here that we haven't even touched on. So I want to give a high level here on some of the kind of key principles when it comes to sustainable design, incentive design, and following best practices. But almost every aspect of your product journey in Web3, if you have a token, will be influenced by tokenomics and vice versa. So understanding different fundraising mechanisms when fundraising from investors, whether that is directly selling equity through a safe plus T, where you're selling a token side letter or warrant with an option for a token, or directly selling a token through a SAFT. How do you consider engaging market makers, centralized exchanges prior to launching your token to ensure that you have appropriate deals that aren't predatory and that you are giving your token the highest possibility of success when it comes to launching? Similarly, when it comes to airdrops and user retention, all of these things um, are very new, but there are very many instances of success stories and failures that can be studied. And so I encourage you to um, always consider, do you need a token? Um, I would have that as my first consideration, to focus on the product. Only really look to a token if you believe it can improve your product, make the product better, and incentivize users. And then when it comes to the design of your token and its token journey through design to launch and post launch, do not underestimate the um, impact and effort that is required when it comes to making this a success. And so some great resources that I would point to for a really great fundamental understanding of tokenomics is Matty Tokenomics, who is now the co-founder of Legion, um, which is a kind of new attempt on public fundraising. I'd encourage you to look at that as well. But if you type into Google, since these links won't be usable, Tokenomics for Builders, the Practitioner's Guide to Token Design by Matty Tokenomics. This, I'd say, is like from a few years ago, the Bible on tokenomics, which is really great reference to lots of external resources and depth that for those that are newer to the practice, or even those experienced, give you a great amount of knowledge and guidance. Then A16Z have some good articles on Guide to Tokens, which cover token structuring when it comes to the legal structuring and how to avoid predatory deals. And then also Forged and others have quite compelling research and insights into, for instance, centralized exchange listing fees, best practices, liquidity requirements, and even software which will take you step by step with notes, with guidance, with examples, will take you through your own token design journey. There are many, many more. If you go on Twitter or if you Google tokenomics best practices resources, please explore them for yourselves. But I would have a look at these three as a good starting point. Um, Hopefully this has been a useful overview for the key considerations of tokenomics. I think that it can be incredibly powerful for a project when done correctly, but it should not be treated lightly. It requires deep expertise in many cases and a huge commitment to ensuring that it's done correctly. So I wish you all the best on your tokenomics learning journeys and your launching of tokens in the future. And thank you for listening to my presentation today, and good luck with the rest of the Arbitrum Open House series. So I think we can wrap up this stream, and thank you all very much.